The text I'm going to be treating in this video actually comes from a book, and I've put the PDF of this on our Canvas page. Okay, so if you look under Files, you'll find this thing called the Utopia Reader. There are 2 or 3 texts that are excerpted in this book that I want to look at this semester or this term. And so that, this is not required reading per se, but it would be good to at least be familiar with where that is and maybe draw from it from time to time. So let's take a look at this. Okay. In the video that asked the question, why utopia? One of the main points that I tried to make there was that in crafting utopian visions, philosophers and other authors often were thinking about the social problems that existed in their world, right? Utopia was, in a way, an exercise in problem solving. Okay, they identified the main social ills of their day and tried to figure out, okay, what do we do to solve this? And it's rare, I think, in fact, it might be unheard of, for any of these utopian visions to be crafted out of whole cloth, as we might say, right? They almost invariably, if you're not familiar with that metaphor, that means created out of nothing that pre-existed. Invariably, utopian visions have models, contemporary or past models in mind. Now, this week's main text, of course, is Plato's Republic. But we need to recognize that even though Plato was an Athenian, spent pretty much his entire life in Athens, had his school called the Academy in Athens, that he, like many of his Athenian contemporaries, was an admirer of Sparta. There were things about the Spartan system that really impressed Plato, really impressed a lot of Athenians. And so I wanted to look at Sparta as a model of utopian thinking or utopian experimentation. And to do this, I'm drawing here on a text that was actually written several hundred years after Plato wrote the Republic. But this was taken from earlier texts, right? So this is from the author Plutarch, who lived in the 1st century CE. So again, about 400 years or so after Plato, and wrote a series of, we might call them biographies, accounts of the lives of ancient figures that he saw as models of good human behavior. So not exactly biographies, they're more works of philosophy. But the nature of that doesn't need to concern us here. I just want to look at what Plutarch says about this. And let me just say that this information, for the most part, can be corroborated with other ancient sources that are closer in time to, the Sparta of that Plato would have been familiar with. Okay. And so this is an account that Plutarch writes of the life of Lycurgus. Lycurgus was, so that's the name Lycurgus, the legendary founder of Sparta. And all of the Spartan system of political and social organization was attributed to him. Now, whether there was a Lycurgus or not, that's that's not clear. There's no direct evidence that this person actually existed. But all of this is attributed to him. And so what's really being discussed here is the kind of lifestyle that the Spartans led, right? And you can see that this is quite utopian in thinking. And that Plutarch, like Plato, was remarking to some extent on the problems that existed in their contemporary society and the way that Sparta dealt with these problems. So one of the problems that they kind of take up here is the issue of equality. Now, both Plato and Sparta lived in very unequal societies. Even though Athens was a democracy, there was still great inequality in wealth and things like that, right? And so if you look at section 9 here, actually even the previous section, right? So from the beginning here, and this is excerpted. This is not, the true beginning of the work. But Plutarch remarks that every Spartan man, and by this he doesn't mean every person who lived in Sparta, because remember, Sparta had conquered its neighbors and had lots of slaves. There were also kind of a lower class of people who lived in Sparta who were known as the perioikoi. They weren't enslaved, but they were subordinate to the elites. But then there was this elite class. They were called in Greek the homoioi. The root word of that is homo, which means the same. And you can see why they were called that. And so these were called the same ones, or sometimes it's translated as the similars. And that's because, according to this system that they worked out, every person who was part of that class, and this was amounted to several thousand men in Sparta, were given a roughly equal amount of property. The property was not held in private, it was maintained by the state, and it was parceled out to each individual person, right? And so if you look at the quote at the end of that first paragraph there, okay, all Laconia, that's another word for kind of all the territory that Sparta controlled, looks like a family estate newly divided among many brothers, right? And so, Sparta was going for equality. Why would they want to do that? Well, remember, Sparta is a highly militaristic society. Everyone fights in the hoplite phalanx. Everyone trains militarily. The hoplite phalanx was a formation that forced people to essentially take up the same position, wield the same weapons as everybody else, right? There is a kind of leveling to mechanism to that whole system. And so, they were trying to create equality, it seems, in other parts of their society as well. In addition to making sure that everybody got a roughly equal amount of farmland, if you'll note in the next paragraph, Lycurgus withdrew all gold and silver money from currency and ordained the use of iron money only. That's the part that's highlighted there. Then, to a great weight and mass of this, he gave a trifling value, so the 10 minas worth, that's a very small amount, that might be, a couple $100 or something like that, required a large storeroom in the house and a yoke of cattle to transport it. Now, one of the questions I'd like to ask students when I have an actual classroom setting is, why would somebody make a currency out of base metal? And there are really two reasons for this, okay? First of all, having precious metal means that one can easily obtain property to exceed that of other people. Gold and silver and jewels and things like that have intrinsic value of their own. So if you have even a small amount of those, that can be a great deal of wealth. And so if he did away with all of that and created a currency that was made out of something that was quite common, well, it only had value because the government said it had value. Okay, people didn't want to kind of strive for that. It wasn't to their advantage to try to procure as much iron currency as they possibly could. And if they did, they would have to build a massive, storage facility for it, because even a small amount in value would be a heavy weight. This would also probably serve as a good workout tool. If you have to move your money around, well, you're going to be lifting weights, okay? The other reason, I think, is that the Spartans were forbidden from, or at least heavily discouraged from, trading with other people. The iron Spartan currency had no value outside of Sparta, right? And so the incentive is to keep people at home, to give them a roughly equal amount of farmland, and a roughly equal number of slaves to work that land, and so everyone is self-sufficient. You don't have to focus on making money and competing with your neighbors for property. Instead, you spend all of your time focused on military things, right? And, given the inequality that existed in Athens, Plato found this to be quite appealing and incorporates some of it into his Republic. Okay, not exactly. He doesn't follow the Spartan system exactly, but you can see the obvious influence in a number of places. Note that he says here, the iron money could not be carried into the rest of Greece, nor had it any value there, as we were saying. There are a number of other things. It might be helpful just to read through the 10 pages or so of this excerpt to get a sense of, how Sparta worked. I don't necessarily want to cover absolutely everything in this video. They all ate together. This is another kind of leveling mechanism with roughly the same food. This would be a way of creating inequality. If some people had access to better food than others, that gives you a sense of, division in society. And Sparta was trying to do away with that and make everyone who was part of the Spartan system roughly equal. The only thing that would allow one to gain an advantage over somebody else is if they performed a military feat that was commendable and gained honor from that. So honor rather than money is kind of the incentive here. Note at the bottom of page 18 here, in the highlighted portion, none of his laws were put into writing by Lycurgus. Indeed, one of the so-called retras, that is decrees, forbids it. For he thought that if the most important and binding principles which conduce to the prosperity and virtue of a city were implanted in the habits and training of its citizens, they would remain unchanged and secure, having a stronger bond than compulsion in the fixed purposes imparted to the young by education, which performs the office of a lawgiver for every one of them. And so, in other words, they didn't have a written version of their laws. We might even say they had no laws per se. They simply tried to live by certain principles. One of these was equality. Another was the kind of military discipline, and there were some other things, okay? And so laws would be unnecessary as a result of that. You wouldn't have to keep writing legal systems and, putting them up in places like they did in, say, with the Code of Hammurabi in Mesopotamia or something like that. That everybody would just know how they were supposed to behave and nobody would be breaking the law. That may sound optimistic, but we'll see that there are a number of the kind of utopian and, frankly, dystopian visions that start with that as one of their foundations. The lack of written laws, or the lack of laws that had to be spelled out. It's rather principles. 1984 by George Orwell is an example of this. He talks about what they did with women, right? This is a very masculine military society, but women were also required to perform physical exercise, and that childbirth was seen as roughly equal to going into battle, right? That a woman who successfully gave birth was lauded for her bravery and given honor for that, especially if she ended up raising sons who became honorable soldiers in the army, and daughters who went on to bear their own children. So there was a certain, not egalitarianism of gender here, but at least the contributions of women were acknowledged. Now Plato's going to take this up and take it to an even greater extreme. One of the questions in most utopian visions is what do we do with genders? What do we do with women? And the kind of division between genders, okay. He does get into their marriage customs. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this. It's kind of bizarre what they do, and there are explanations for this, but you can read through that. If you want to ask questions about this in discussion board or in a live session or something like that, I'd be happy to go on at some length discussing this with you. But suffice it to say that the marriages were arranged, and there was no love or romance involved in this, because the men were encouraged to focus all of their time and attention on their military duties, right? And so if they want to see their wives, they need to sneak out of the barracks and then get back to the barracks as soon as they're done. Basically, copulating with their wives, and so the family relationship is kind of disincentivized, or it becomes not an important factor in people's lives. The state, the polis, is the really important thing that everyone is devoted to, right? They killed deformed children. Okay, what do you do with the disabled? Well, in this utopian vision, you just get rid of them. You throw them off a mountain. And anybody who doesn't kind of live up to the strict standards and requirements of the society is humiliated and made an example of. And so they really are trying to produce a single type of person, a single type of man, a great warrior, one devoted entirely to Sparta, to kind of give vent to their passions, so to speak. They did provide sexual outlets, that is, that they could, that there were homosexual relations, and these were encouraged within Sparta, right? That soldiers who were lovers tended to fight hard for each other was kind of the thought here, and that's something that was true not only in Sparta but in lots of other parts of Greece as well. Okay, so there's more to this, right? But I think we've covered some of the essential points here. Let me see if there's anything else that. So let's just read this quote right in the middle of page 25, the highlighted part here. In a word, he trained his fellow citizens to have neither the wish nor the ability to live for themselves, but like bees, they were to make themselves always integral parts of the whole community, clustering together about their leader, almost beside themselves with enthusiasm and noble ambition, and to belong wholly to their country. So that is where the loyalty is, right? Not to families or individuals, but to the country itself. And everything that was put into place was toward that end, okay? This is something that Plato admired greatly. And, when he sets up Republic, he's like, look, romance, love, things like that gets in the way, right? Families can get in the way of a well-functioning society. We've got to deal with these problems. We need to create one, a society that's egalitarian in some way, where that is functioning well, really achieving its greatest potential. And for Plato, a lot of what Sparta did checked those boxes for him. Not everything, but a lot of what Sparta did. So this is a really important piece of context for understanding Plato. All right, thank you.